The subject is non-Jewish Jews. Jews who are halachically, that is by Jewish law, not Jews, but who think of themselves and act in Israel as if they were part of the Jewish collective. The first memory of conversion in Judaism is the biblical book of Ruth, which apparently dates prior to the kings of Israel, about roughly 1,000 years before the Common Era, before Jesus Christ. She, Ruth, belonged to the people of Moab, or Moab in English. Her story is very complex, and I will not go into it. But what is important for us is that Ruth, the Moabite, and the Jewish dignitary by the name of Boaz fell in love with each other. The mother of Boaz, whose name was Naomi, sensed there would be problems if Ruth were to stay in Judea together with Boaz. But Ruth answers with a phrase that has become one of the most eloquent and beautiful in the Old Testament. She says, "Do not urge me to leave, to go back to Moab, or to return from following you and Boaz. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." The Bible does not mention any clear conversion process that Ruth underwent in order to become a Jew. On the face of it, a simple reading would be that Ruth had committed herself to the Jewish people, and that was enough. But of course, to be very fair, the fact that a ceremony is not described does not mean that there was no ceremony. But one thing that the Bible certainly does, it goes out of its way to explain with glowing words that King David was her offspring. In other words, she was the mother of King David, the great hero of Jewish history. There have been many other famous cases of conversion. I just mentioned two. One, was a Roman royal who converted to Judaism about the 1st century of the Common Era. His name was Onkelos. You probably have not heard of him, perhaps you have. And he translated the Bible into Aramaic. Probably for Ukrainians and those living in this area, in the 7th century, the Khuzari people, whose empire extended from Kievan Rus to the Black Sea to the Volga, converted as well. At least some of them did. Let us take a jump. On the computer you say fast forward. Let us fast forward to the 20th and 21st centuries. And our specific case is, of course, the immigrants from the former Soviet Union who began coming in waves to Israel about the year 1990 when the Soviet Union collapsed. In terms of the existing citizens of Israel, the former Soviet Jews added about 20% to the population. Now, if that number seems small, try it on Ukraine. Ukraine has, 45 million, 46 million people? Imagine that 20% of that population, 9 million or so, would all of a sudden arrive in the country. What an enormous responsibility, burden, how difficult the problem would be. This 20% equaled 1 million people. And this problem needs to be made even more difficult when you consider that the Ukraine has 600,000 square kilometers. And Israel, inside the Green Line, has 20,000 kilometers. In other words, there were these million Soviet immigrants, roughly 20% of the population, who came all at once, more or less a decade and a half, and they needed to be housed. Work needed to be found for them, education for their children, and so on. It requires very little imagination to understand that this process of absorption of this million or so people was problematic. But the project of integrating 1 million people raised another question besides the practical ones that I've just raised. Today, nearly 30 years after the Soviet Union collapsed, about 1/3 or so, a little bit less, are not considered Jewish by the Israeli rabbinate. They do not have either a Jewish mother, nor were they converted. In the rabbinate's eyes, a Jew is defined in only two ways: a Jewish mother and conversion today, let us say, by an Orthodox rabbi. Why just the mother and not the father? Well, the reason is simple. With the mother, you know that she gave birth. It's very difficult to tell who the father was. Perhaps, and I've heard progressive Jews say this, we could test DNA and we could know who the father was, but of course that was not one of the things that the rabbis were wondering about 100 years ago. So 1/3 of these Jews are not Jewish by halacha. And as we shall see, this has become an impossibly confusing, inconsistent issue in Israeli politics until this very day. In order to have the ex-Soviet, and when I say that, I don't mean only Russians, I mean, of course, Ukrainians, Poles, etc., who came to Israel. We need to understand what is called the law of return. The law that allows Jews of whatever kind, Orthodox, non-Orthodox, etc., allows them to return to Israel automatically. Israel was the home of the Jewish people until 2,000 years ago. The Palestinians are quite right that it was their land in the past few centuries. But for many Jews, what this means is that Israel has two indigenous people. Two people who belong to this land, and the fact that one cannot read a prayer in the synagogue, in the prayer book, or study virtually any form of Jewish tradition without coming back to the same words: Israel, Jerusalem, Zion, etc., our home, we want to go back, etc. So we need to start with a short description of the law of return. The right of Jews worldwide to come to Israel and become automatically citizens of the state of Israel. But now, just for starters, let me say, this does not mean that those who come to Israel under the law of return and get full citizenship are necessarily recognized as Jews. They can come back as returning Jews, and yet the rabbinate will make it clear that these are not Jews that have come back under the law of return, and their Jewishness is an entirely separate subject. Why did the law of return, as it was formulated by the Knesset Why did they make such a law, dividing between those who are Jewish and those who are what I will call non-Jewish Jews? The reason was really quite practical and realistic. Israel is a country that has today about 75% Jews, about 20% Arabs, and in between there are many of those, often coming from the ex-Soviet Union, who fall into a strange middle category. What they were afraid of, these legislators in Knesset, was that if they said, you are a Jewish mother, have given birth to Jewish children, and you would consider coming to Israel, would you leave your husband back in the ex-Soviet Union? They knew that that would not happen. What if your brother, or your sister, or your children, or your grandchildren, or your grandparents, etc., felt that we cannot be separated as a family? Israel argued that the law of return should be as widely formulated as possible, so that, this is rather funny, if you had a Jewish grandfather and he had died and you wanted to come to Israel under the law of return, you could. So this was a very policy, strategy-oriented idea. Get as many Jews of various kinds into Israel, as many as you can, to keep the divide between Arabs and Jews at the roughly 80-20% that now is, more or less. Israel speaks of itself, as you know, as a Jewish and a democratic state. If the minority of Arabs would go up, say, to 60%, that would be a serious problem in terms of the claim that Israel was a democratic state, given that 60% of the population were not Jewish. It must be noted that the new immigrants get all kinds of subsidies from the government. They came to Israel with some rubles or some grivna or some zloty or whatever, and of course this bought next to nothing. They needed apartments, and apartments in Israel are very expensive. They needed money to retrain for a new job. There was a great deal that the government had to do to solve their absorption. But again, going back to the heart of the matter, who is a Jew? Probably no three words have been mentioned in Israeli public life in the past 70 years. Because the problem of who is a Jew became so complex and inconsistent over the years, the Israeli government did something very simple. On your identification card, it no longer speaks of you as Jewish, Muslim, Christian, whatever, it's just a blank space. That is not to say that the Ministry of Population Control doesn't have that information somewhere, but on the identity card, it is not mentioned. A few words are necessary to set this in context. As I said, who is a Jew is one of the most widely discussed problematic issues as Israel comes about its 70th year birthday. As I noted, the rabbinate has fought tooth and nail to keep this old Jewish mother conversion a formula. Secular, on the other hand, have tried to loosen the categories dramatically. The secular insist that many more modern criteria should be used. Having a Jewish father, for example. The law of return is very old. It begins in 1950, 2 years after the State of Israel is founded. And it was not thought of as a source of problems. It was simply written and it was obvious. After the travails, the sufferings of the Holocaust, when the Nazis were not particularly interested in what Halacha said, they did not care if someone's mother or father was religious. It seemed in Israel that bickering and fighting over who is a Jew seemed tasteless and inappropriate. If someone suffered in Auschwitz and didn't have a Jewish mother, could one possibly say he wasn't Jewish? Whether he converted or not. Wasn't it clear that everyone who had survived the great tragedy and wanted to immigrate, this is not to America or Germany that were rich countries. I'm talking about Israel, which is a small country, troubled by enemies on all sides. It was a poor country. In the 1950s, it was qualified as second world, not first world. And as late as the mid-60s, a Supreme Court justice wrote, quote, "There is no great importance to the precision of the legal definition of the Jew, because the law of return, after all, was not created for the sake of legal definitions." But controversy was inevitable. It set Jews as a nationality against Jews as a narrowly religious group. And this issue has dogged the country all along. In 1958, just to give a few small examples, the Minister of the Interior, who was then a secular Jew, said that if both immigrating parents, whatever their Jewishness was, declared that they desire to have their children registered as Jews, even if the mother was not Jewish, this should be done. The children should be registered as Jews. The National Religious Party, the Orthodox Party, left the coalition, bringing down the government. Interestingly, Ben-Gurion, a very prophetic personality who said many things about the future that only today are becoming quite clear, he responded to the coalitional crisis, the fall of the government, in a manner that is strikingly contemporary. Indeed, his words are worth quoting, even at length, because much of what he said decades ago lies at the heart of the argument over the status of halachically non-Jews, non-Jewish Jews from the Soviet Union. He wrote, the Jewish collective in Israel is not the same as the Jewish collective in the diaspora. He meant mostly the United States. Here, we are not a minority under the pressure of an alien culture. There is no fear here of Jews assimilating into non-Jewish surroundings. The surroundings are, of course, entirely Jewish. And this happens, this assimilation into surrounding environment takes place all over the world. So in the United States, the number is somewhere near 60% already of marriages between Jews and non-Jews. Quite the opposite, Ben-Gurion continues. Here, in Israel, the tendency is reverse. There is a good chance of his words, a mild assimilation of non-Jews into the Jewish people, especially mixed married families that immigrated to Israel. Although mixed marriages abroad, the United States, are one of the most decisive elements in the total assimilation of the Jewish people, mixed marriages in Israel, couples that come to Israel, mixed marriage, in practice, and these are the critical words, become totally blended into the Jewish people. Ben-Gurion, though, was something of a scholar, and he did not want to decide on such a critical issue on himself, by himself. So he wrote 70 letters to the leading Jewish intellectuals, rabbis, philosophers, journalists, etc., asking them what to do. Who is, in fact, a Jew? The famous joke, if there are 70 opinions, they're all different. And many, many different views were presented. Their answers were complex, and they are far beyond what we will talk about today, but it is worth noting that many of them were utterly confused by the question. It is not a question that has often been asked in Jewish history. One did not choose to join the Jewish people in Kishinev in 1880. One did not choose to join the Jewish people in 1492 in Spain. Choosing to remain part of the Jewish people was a deep commitment to things that are Jewish. So the idea of non-Jewish Jews is a relatively modern problem. Some of those who answered these letters were very creative. They said, okay, there is halachic Jewry, but someone who was not halachic Jewries could be spoken of as Hebrews. They could be spoken of as Jewish residents, political Jews, Jews from a Jewish father, the one I like the best, declared Jews, permanent residents, alien residents. Interestingly, a few decades later, a group of progressive Knesset members decided to make an important step. They said, okay, we cannot deny what the rabbi said. It is in Jewish tradition for thousands of years. But what we can do is to set up courts for secular conversion. And those who would study for secular conversion would need to study Jewish history, Bible, Torah, etc. And if they accepted what they studied, I hereby declare, then they are Jews. This is a very interesting suggestion, but given the power of the ultra-Orthodox rabbinate, it had very, very little chance of passing. But the who is a Jew issue takes on some truly bizarre, odd, unprecedented issues in the following years. We recall one secular minister of Interior said parents want their kids to be Jewish, they're Jewish. But then, as happens in Israeli coalitions, things switch. And the new Interior Minister, who was from the religious parties, said that there was no such thing, no such animal as a secular Jew, and Jewishness had to remain what it had always been, Jewish mother, conversion. The Ministry of Interior swung back and forth. It's difficult to describe all the zigzags, all the lurching and the faltering and moving from one side to another when religious ministers of Interior, non-religious ministers of Interior had to solve the problem of who is a Jew. And then comes the most bizarre case of who is a Jew that has ever been. There was a man, he passed away, whose name was Oswald Rufeisen, better known in Israel as Brother Daniel, brother in the sense of a monk in the Christian orders. He had, to put it mildly, a very strange upbringing. He was born in Poland, but he was born to Polish and German-speaking parents. So his Polish and his German were flawless. There were no Yiddish accents in there. And and he was hidden in a monastery to prevent being caught by the Nazis. But the Nazis thought, well, this is a wonderful opportunity. Here's someone who speaks German and Polish, and he can be a wonderful translator for the Nazis who have now invaded Poland. Hans Frank, the head Nazi in Poland, welcomed him with open arms. But Brother Daniel, was a Jew. And he got out of the horrors of the Holocaust by being a translator between two languages. It is said that he did all he could to save Jews through these small jobs that he had of translating. He would put these here and these there so as to prevent Jews from being killed. He was born very close to Auschwitz, coincidentally. As I said, he was hid in a Catholic monastery, translator between Polish and German, and he survived the Holocaust. He went to seminary in Poland and became a Catholic priest and joined the Carmelite monks. The center of the Carmelite monks is in Haifa in Israel. And Rufeisen filled out all the forms and asked to be allowed to enter Israel as a returning Jew. This is utterly without precedent. A Catholic priest wanting to come to Israel as a Jew. There had never been anything like it before. And in some ways, the most curious part of the problem was that according to Halacha, he was a Jew. Halacha does not recognize the fact that he converted to Catholicism. He is a Jew, and the ultra-Orthodox and the Orthodox were reeling with incomprehension, with confusion, and with inconsistency. The case was brought to the Supreme Court in Israel, and everyone was watching. How were they going to get out of this knot? The court, I think with great wisdom, said, Of course, having a Jewish mother is important, not converting religiously also, but let us ask the man in the street, not halacha, not read Talmudic texts, but ask the man in the street what he thought. Could a Catholic priest become a Jew for the sake of the law of return? The court decided no. A Catholic Jew cannot be, a Catholic priest cannot be a Jew. And so the formula was extended. A Jew is someone born of a Jewish mother, converted, and not a member of another religion. That has come and stayed more or less the current state of affairs. A few years later, another case took place, not as bizarre as the Brother Daniel case, but with a lot more influence and power for the future. Major Binyamin Shalit, a major in the Tank Corps, decorated war hero, married a Swedish woman who wasn't Jewish. They had children, and Shalit insisted on them being registered as part of the Jewish nation, but under religion, no religion. The court struggled with this forever too, because it's impossible to deal with easily. And in this case, in a 9-4 hotly debated court case, the court decided that in fact Shalit's children should be registered as Jews. It was at that point that what I told you just a minute ago happened. The identification card no longer reads Jew, Christian, etc., because it was just too complicated to answer that question. Israel's very shaky coalition was strained to the breaking point over this court's decision. The National Religious Party declared unconditionally that Jews cannot be dissociated from halacha, that the definition of a Jew depends on what has been thought of as a Jew for thousands of years. They worked very hard, the court and then the Ministry of Interior, to solve the problem that the Shalit case had arranged. And they came up with a clever kind of formulation. There were two areas. There were those who came under the law of return, and there were those who came as Jews. the definition of those who came as Jews remained strictly halachic, as it always had been, but as a kind of compensation, the law of return was widened very considerably. I mentioned at the beginning, sons, daughters, wives, grandparents, etc., could come even though they were not Jewish, in order to strengthen the Jewish character of the state. So, by the law of return, everyone and his brother could come as a Jew, as a law of returnee, and halachically, when it came to being registered in the population ministry, they were referred to as non-Jews. They would receive full citizenship, but not be recognized as Jews. The reason for this very broad inclusion, spouses, children, grandchildren, and so on, it was in order to strengthen Israel's Jewish majority in the state of Israel. Now, just a moment, I'd like to give you a comparison. Imagine that Kyiv, with its 5 million people or so, were surrounded by hundreds of millions of anti-Kyivians. The paranoia level would be quite high. The fear that inside Kyiv there were sleeper cells, spies belonging to whomever, and you get a sense of what Israel felt like when it made this law of return. Most of those who came from the ex-Soviet Union, especially after the mid-90s, came for very instrumental reasons. So the ex-Soviet Union had collapsed. I don't need to tell you about the Yeltsin era, which was a catastrophe. Many of them came because they thought Israel was a secure place, as strange as that may sound. And Israel was important. It was important for them that Jews come. From their point of view, their coming to Israel was no longer a matter of the very first wave of Aliyah, who were people who loved Zion, who were Zionists, even a small portion of whom were religious. They came also on instrumental grounds. The two instrumentalisms merged together very well. The Soviet Jews asking questions like education, building, job opportunities, culture, and so on. The Israeli government saying, the hell with this religious business. If they come, will they side with us or will they side with the Arabs? And the clear conclusion that they had, and that has been justified again and again, is that they would self-justify, they would ally themselves with the Jewish people in Israel and not with the Arabs. So you have this strange case where in certain ways they are Jewish, and then, and I'm talking about 1950, they added as a secondary, almost not important kind of addendum to the rule that there is also a family clause. Very unclear at the time, but if your wife was a Jew or not a Jew, or your children, your grandparents, etc., let them come in. Nobody thought anything of it at the time. How many non-Jews after Auschwitz came to Israel? There were dozens or so, and Ben-Gurion said absolutely injustice. When they come here, they'll blend into the Jewish people rather than the Jewish people lose their Jewishness over a few tens or hundreds of immigrants. I'm not sure how much I should go into detail here, because the greater detail I go into, the more inconsistent and confusing the laws become. Okay, they could make aliyah under the law of return of the Jewish people, etc., but how would they be registered? I told you that registration on the identity card was slowly done away with. But registration, in other regards, the ministry of this and the ministry of that was very, very clear. One word, stepping back into history. Israel, of course, Palestine, was under the Ottoman Empire till after the First World War. The Ottoman Empire had this strange law that nowhere else exists that I know of, in which different religious communities were treated differently in that each had its own hierarchy, from the Muslim patriarch all the way down, from the Jewish chief rabbi, from the Christian, whatever, all the way down. They did this, the Ottomans, because they thought that with a multicultural, polyglot country, there was no way of placing national belonging. After all, Ottoman Empire existed from Eastern India all the way through North Africa. How could they do that? So they did that in religious terms. I just should add that the Jews were given citizenship, but the Arab word is dhimma. Dhimma meaning second-class citizens, in effect, who had to pay tax to live in the Ottoman Empire, etc. But what's important for us is that when in 1918, 17, the British Mandate began after the First World War, controlling Palestine, the British Mandate, they took over the Ottoman laws. And Israel, when it was founded, also took over the Ottoman laws. Now this has some very strange consequences, because every religion was arranged hierarchically and into itself. Jews could not be married to Muslims because there was no Jewish Muslim group. There were only Jews who could be married by rabbis, and that would mean halachic Jews, Muslims and Christians as well. Now, what this has done in modern Israel is quite funny. Israel will not recognize, the rabbinate will not recognize a marriage not done by the Orthodox, by Reform or Conservative or whatnot. Israel has no provision for civil marriage, the way you can go to the city hall and get married, I presume, in most places in the world. So what happens if you don't want a religious wedding, or you cannot have a religious wedding for reasons I've just given, what many, many people do is they fly to Cyprus or to Czechoslovakia or many other places where there are lines and lines of Israelis who want to get married, because according to Israeli law, if you are married outside of the country must recognize you as a married couple. This doesn't help very much in terms of their children and whether they will be considered Jewish or not. Of course, the problem came to a height when the third of the ex-Soviet immigrants arrived in Israel. The strangest thing happened. They began slowly to integrate their lives in the Jewish Israeli fashion. Their children would go to the kindergarten and learn about Hanukkah and learn about Passover, and they would come home with these Passover plates where you put the various elements and say, Mom, Dad, why don't we do this in the house? They'd come home with Hanukkah menorahs made of various materials and say, why don't we light candles like all the others? And slowly it began to sink in. Now, I say slowly, I mean capital S, capital. It is taking time. They are moving slowly from a group that is segregated in themselves, a group that lives in cultural ghettos, who have only Russian friends, Russian is not the word, ex-Soviet friends, but over time, this has changed. Over time, or I would say more carefully, over time, this is changing. These Jews, who are often called non-Jewish Jews, as strange a phrase as that there is, these non-Jewish Jews, first of all, were accepted fully by Israel's secular population. They worked in Israeli businesses, they spoke Hebrew, their children mainly went to the army, which is a great unifying force. They succeeded in business. They were, after all, intelligentsia by comparison to many others. And all this together, growing wealth, facility in Hebrew, understanding the Jewish culture of Israel, made them very slowly, and this is not something that will happen in a day, it takes generations. I told Lana on the way here that I and my wife come from the United States. We were born in the United States and went to Israel some 50 years ago. And we, of course, speak English to each other. My theory is that the language in which you give your first kiss is the language that you continue speaking with your... We also tried, succeeded in speaking English to our children. And they speak really unaccented American English. But here comes the real problem. Will they continue speaking English to their children? For what it's worth, as statistics, 2 of my 3 children have not. They speak Hebrew to their children. And what's even funnier is that if my son is sitting here and he turns from me to his sister, to me, he'll speak English. He turns his head to his sister, he speaks Hebrew. It becomes an absolute mishmash of languages. And it is well known that...
5 minutes.
What?
5 minutes.
5 minutes? It becomes well known that Russian, ex-Soviet immigrants will often make fun of the way their grandchildren speak Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, etc. Okay. Let me see what else is of importance. The ministry, the Central Bureau of Statistics, has made a number of very confusing and inconsistent attempts to solve the problem. For example, they've changed the category to the extended Jewish people, including those who were not religiously Jewish. Some others, a little bit later, said Jews and others. I don't know exactly what others could possibly mean, but it's a very strange locution. Yes, one of the strangest, kookiest things is that Israeli Arabs are classified as Arabs even if they are Christian. 10% of Israeli Arabs are Christian, about 100,000. But if you take those ex Soviet immigrants who identify themselves as Christians, they will be placed in the Jewish and others category, while the Catholic Arabs are not. Just showing how complex this issue can be. Let me just see if anything else of great importance to say. Now, if some of you are real mathematicians and have counted up the numbers that I've made, this percent, that percent, etc., and are wondering, doesn't he know arithmetic? It doesn't fit. Please let me assure you that I know arithmetic and that I know mathematics more or less, but the inconsistency is not mine. The inconsistency belongs to the Minister of Interior. Let me just get to the end. Just 1 second. In a word, without formal religious procedures, Israel's non-Jewish Jews are becoming part of the Jewish Israeli national collectivity by what I like to call sociological conversion. There has never been anything like it in Jewish history. Even the most liberal, progressive forms of Judaism require some education, some ceremony. But here you have a case where people simply merge in to the Jewish Israeli population because their children do, and their friends do, and their work colleagues do, and the language is Hebrew, and the calendar is Jewish, and so on. The problem that the Bureau of Statistics has is its own problem. But these non-Jewish Jews are becoming more and more Jewish by what they are doing and not what the rabbis are saying. The rabbis may raise hell about their being Jewish, but nevertheless, they are becoming more and more Jewish, and particularly for secular Jews in the university, for example. No one will ever ask you, is your mother Jewish? Have you converted according to Halacha? Not at all. In the secular world in which they travel, they have very few obstacles. And I'd like to end with a story or an image that each of you will understand very well. You can have, in the same apartment house, door next to door, a woman who has mother, wife, who has sociologically converted to Judaism. And for her, this sociological conversion means that she will celebrate holidays and much, much more. Next door to them is a secular Israeli couple who are Jewish in every kosher stamp possible. But they are not interested in observing the holidays or in teaching their children Jewish stuff and all the rest. So here you have the dissonant reality in which the more observant, more Jewish couple is not Jewish, while the couple next door who are Jewish do not observe Jewishness in any major way. If you can figure that out, then you're much better than I am. Thank you very much. If there's anyone who wants to ask a question, certainly.
About the Christian Arabs, you were talking a little bit about them, and you said they're mostly Catholic Christians.
No, not Catholic. East,
Oh,
Greek Orthodox,
Greek Orthodox.
Maronite,
Okay.
and
That was the word which kept me wondering. Like,
no, they're not. There are 2 or 3 villages in the north of Israel that are Catholic, but for the most part, they are Maronite Christians.
Yeah, because there were actually certain information which we got from other courses, but a few informations yet about the Orthodox Muslims who live in Israel, and actually the Christian Orthodox, of course, and actually the Kyiv-Milan Academy has an interesting tradition that in 17th century, for instance, there was a group of Christian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox Arabs who came from Syria to study here, which is a separate story. Yet it's also.
What is interesting to add about Christian Arabs, not only in Israel, but all through the Middle East, is that they are leaving. They are very much afraid of the surroundings in which they live, and more are emigrating to the West. Lebanon, for example, but many other countries who are immigrating to the West. All right, so someone else asked me a question. Yes, please.
How do you think, I just wanted to hear your opinion about Arabs and their assimilation not assimilation, but maybe integration into Israeli society, Israeli, I don't know, well, could it be more intensive in educate, or maybe I don't know how Israeli state can regulate this thing, and does Israeli state
Yes. Say it in Ukrainian.
interested in it or not?
Okay, now that is the subject for the lecture I will give when I come back next year. It's an enormous subject and very complicated. It is true, clearly, that Israeli Arabs do not see themselves as Zionists. The National Anthem of Israel says, "We have waited for thousands of years to come back to our homeland." Now, they can't sing that because they've been living in the country for the past centuries. So, is there a tension between Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews? Yes, definitely. But there is a spectrum. At the extreme conservative, there are those who consider themselves part of the Muslim movement, who at their extremes even support ISIS or Daesh or whatever you call it. But for the most part, Israeli Arabs say the following. If I had to encapsulate it in a phrase, we are not Zionists. We do not share the Zionist narrative of the Jewish national liberation movement called Zionism. The Zionists have expelled many of our own people and so on. But would I want to live anywhere else? The answer becomes very small. Israeli Arabs who are asked if and when, hopefully, there will be a two-state solution, do they want to move to Palestine or stay in Israel? The vast majority say stay in Israel. They express themselves in one phrase: they are a villa in the jungle. They live in a villa, Israel, in a jungle. Just look around. On their northeast, there is Syria, which is falling apart, which is not a state, which is partly Iran, partly Russian, partly pro-American, partly Druze and all the rest. Iraq has never really become a state again, despite attempts at doing so. Yemen is a failed state by any. Libya is a failed state with 500 militias and fiefdoms and kingdoms. Egypt is a solid country, but it's dictatorial and repressive, etc. So that although it is true that Israeli Arabs tend to feel a certain animosity toward Israel as a Jewish state, if, for example, we mentioned the National Anthem and the thousands of years that Jews have yearned, if, as has been suggested many times, a second paragraph be added, and it being that all people in Israel are equal and equal rights and all that, and a lot of that might go away. But the direction today seems to be in the other direction. In what, for me, to be personal, is the wrong direction. More and more, the religious right coalition is moving away from making Israel a more egalitarian state. I'm not sure if you read it in the newspaper, but a very few months ago, Israel passed a law that for many people was the red scarf in front of the bull to make them charge further and get angrier, was a bill that said that Israel is the exclusive national state of the Jewish people. Now, for many, for all Arabs, this was a poke in the eye. And there are many attempts to have it revised so as to include, and of course, everyone who lives in Israel is equal as a citizen, etc., etc. But this last bill, the Chok HaLaomer, was called the nationality rule, has made many people deeply uncomfortable. But the answer in terms of the Israeli Arabs, if I had to say it in one sentence only, that the better they are treated by the Israeli government, the less hostility that they feel. Did you get that? The better they are treated by the Israeli government, the less they feel hostility. For example, just one last example, and I will let you go. When Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated in 1994, and the entire question of peace with the Arabs became a real issue, my wife, who teaches in a college near where we live, there was a ceremony in memory of Yitzhak Rabin, and she and all her Arab students stood there together. The Arabs would not sing the national anthem, of course. They lowered their heads, and tears were streaming down their face. So it's possible to make great changes. The current government does not seem to want to. Okay, so thank you very much once again.